Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Homeschool Minnesota. My name is Dayle Annand. Homeschool Minnesota podcast is an outreach of Minnesota Association of Christian Home Educators, MACHE. We're so glad that you guys are here. You know, as homeschool families, one of the things we like to do is give our kids really good literature. And as I was reading the reviews at the beginning of this book, this is what we're going to be talking. Well, Sacred Scales is the book that I have. But Bryan Davis, if you've been to the MACHE convention, you probably know him, is a very prolific writer, and he has a lot of great books. And I liked the review at the beginning of this book. It was written by a 13-year-old girl, Annabeth. She writes, "When I first picked up this book, I didn't know what to expect. By the time I finished the first chapter, I couldn't put it down. I love the way Bryan Davis mixes dragons and faith. It is a very touching experience." I think the whole thing, how he mixes dragons and faith, we're going to talk about. I just love that line. I thought that was cool. One of the best things about Bryan Davis's The Sacred Scales is the ability to bring you into another world that brings fantasy and faith together. So I'm very excited to welcome Bryan Davis. Hi, Bryan.
Hello, Dayle. Good morning, and thank you for having me on.
Thanks for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know that you are a homeschool dad.
Yes, my wife and I homeschooled all 7 of our kids all the way through high school. And we started back in 1983, back when it was weird to do homeschooling.
Yeah.
Now it's far more mainstream, but we've enjoyed it all the way. And one of the reasons I started writing is because I wanted to help homeschoolers get the kinds of books they love.
Yeah. And kids love fantasy books. You know, we were talking before the podcast just briefly about how really in the Christian realm, you have fantasy like Narnia, obviously, Lord of the Rings, but there's not, you don't have a whole lot of real solid fantasy genre, but kids love that. And so your books bring that fantasy in, but also bring Christianity and the truth of Christianity into it as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I was impressed and inspired by C.S. Lewis and Narnia and how he blended fantasy with faith. But I don't want to make people think that I'm the only one who's out there. I mean, there are a lot of great authors.
There are.
And there are some more out there. So
Yes.
I'm not alone. I was just one of the early ones.
Yeah, that's true. And you have but the thing is you have a lot of different series. And so we're
Yes, I
going to
do.
talk a little bit about that. First of all, why is it so important to you to bring faith into your books, and how difficult is it to combine fantasy and faith?
It's difficult sometimes. I mean, if you look at some of the fantasy books that are out there that are non-Christian, some of them are really dark and teach lessons that we wouldn't want our kids to believe or act on for sure. So when you get into stories that you know aren't real and can't possibly be real, the challenge is to blend it so that kids will believe in the faith parts, even though they can dismiss the non-real parts. You know, Jesus told stories all the time. And when his disciples asked him to explain it, he would explain it. And then we would have a lesson from it. He even used some you might call fantastical stories, because if you look at how often do you see people walk on water or a fig tree wither, and he said, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Camels passing through the eye of a needle is also a fantastical story, but there are still lessons behind it. And if you took every miracle that Jesus performed and took that story and put it into a book, say, change the name and set it on a distant planet, the category would be fantasy. The difference is Jesus could make it happen.
It was real.
So I want to show kids that some fantastical things that you don't have to believe, but believe the faith behind them. And that is a challenging thing, to make the faith look real and concrete, even if it's wrapped in a fantasy story.
Yeah, that would be complicated because you don't want kids to think that faith is fantasy as well. Yeah.
That's why in my stories, I always have humans, and they're the ones that show the faith in the midst of the fantastical story. That makes it more real and down to earth.
Yeah. And it teaches good character qualities. Talk about just some of the different character qualities that your characters, some good, like there's good godly character in there. Can you talk about just some of that, why that's important and how you kind of bring that into?
Sure. Every one of my stories, I always show a hero. It's showing sacrificial love. I'll do anything to help this person who's more helpless than I am, that's trapped, who's in a situation that they're too weak to get out of. I'll have a hero step up and sacrifice himself willing to sacrifice his life, though I don't have very many dying heroes, a few exceptions, but they're willing to do it. So sacrificial love is throughout all my books. Also, mercy and forgiveness is a really big
Mm,
characteristic of some of my stories. Contentment is another one. Being satisfied, content with what God has given you. Healing, having people help others who are sick or crippled or maimed, and the compassion behind all
yeah.
that. And those and more, but those are some of the big ones.
Yeah, that's so good. You've written so many books and many series. We'll talk about those a little bit here, but this one, The Sacred Scales, takes place in Camelot and is written for kids as ages 8 to 12,
Mhm.
ish. I mean, obviously, if your child's a really good reader, you can go ahead and introduce it a little early and if it's just, and anybody can read anything once they learn how to read.
And read out loud to the younger ones too.
Yes, yes, it's a great read aloud for a family. In Minnesota right now when it's January and cold and we're getting a polar vortex coming this weekend, it's a great time to just hunker down with a good book to read out loud to everybody and just enjoy some family time. But your other series were written for young adults, high schoolers, that's kind of the target audience. But how do you, when you're writing, two questions. First of all, how do you, when you're writing, adjust for your audience? Like when you're used to writing young adult, now you're writing a little bit younger. You obviously had to do some adjustments for that. So what does that look like? And then the other question I had was just when you're writing like fantasy kind of things with it and combining like faith and character and all of that into it, do you ever run into kids who have a hard time distinguishing between the fantasy part of it? I mean, or is I guess my thought is like I have I have our kids when we introduced them to Narnia, they freaked out when the White Witch turned Tumnus into a statue because they thought that that was something that could potentially happen. And so we had to remember that okay, they're young, maybe they're too young. So how do you know what age group you're writing for? I guess is the and how do you adjust for that?
Well, one of the things is I make the characters match the age. If I'm writing for teenagers, I usually have teenage heroes. If I'm writing for younger kids, I'll have younger kid heroes. For the younger kids, situations usually are not as intense. You don't have a lot of someone getting stabbed and bleeding and so forth for
Yeah.
the younger kids. The older kids, there's more mortal danger. If you don't get this done, the entire world will end, that kind of thing. And the situations can be at any moment you're about to die. So it's typical fantasy sci-fi where the stakes are incredibly high, but for the younger kids, they usually won't be that high. Any kind of intense violence is going to be off screen, no gore, nothing like that. I usually stay away from gore in the older ones too, but have less extreme violence for sure for the younger kids. Also, for vocabulary, for the younger kids, if I want to use a word, I might have another kid, well, what does that mean? Or ask the adult, or make sure it's in context that it's easy to understand. And the difficult lessons, I don't want my kids to have a sermon preached to them, but they could talk to each other about it. Say, what do you think that means? Or what is that symbol all about? And they can discuss it. So I might make the symbolism a little more obvious for the younger ones and not dumb down at all. I will still use the vocabulary and the spiritual truths,
Mhm.
but I allow it to come out more clearly in the younger kids while the older readers ponder in their
Yeah.
stories.
Yeah. Yeah, 'cause in books like Narnia and Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of symbolism of
Mhm.
Christianity, and so you have to kind of find that and go with it, a little bit. So for younger kids who take things so literal, it's harder for them maybe to find those symbols within the
Well, you,
story.
you also asked about, do I ever run into kids who have a trouble separating fantasy from
Yeah.
reality? Actually, I have one of my own kids, but that's where the parent comes in and has
Yes.
to see that the dividing line isn't very clear. Okay, maybe we should be back in reality books for a while until some more maturity comes in. And, we can't dismiss the importance of the parent making those judgment calls.
Yeah. I think too, one of the things that I love about kids is their imagination and that you can always bring kids back to to earth. You really can. But you want them to have that imagination and be able to put themselves in the story. And that's the thing about your books is because like with the Sacred Scales, the characters are younger. So those kids can put themselves in that story with those kids because they're relatable kids. They're
Sure.
not kids that just like, sometimes I read, just fiction and I would say probably a lot of it is like when I read certain Christian fiction, it's like, this is just so unbelievable. I can't relate to these characters at all. But your characters tend to be very realistic. Do you
Thanks.
do you base your characters on like you had 7 kids. So
Mhm.
I want to say that probably do your kids ever read your books and go, "Okay, Dad."
Well, no, none of them has read all of them
Okay.
because I have more than 50 books
Yeah,
now.
you have a lot.
Early on, they all read all of them, but when they got older and had their own kids, they didn't have as much time to read. But I do remember what they are all about. The kind of kids that I write for tend to be intelligent. They tend to have good vocabularies. They tend to be able to solve complex problems. And just put it bluntly, they exercise their intelligence more than any other kids do. If they're reading my books, they're readers and they enjoy good story. So I make my characters pretty smart for their age. Hawk and Sabina in that story, they're pretty smart. They haven't figured out everything, but they're able to solve complex problems. So that's one reason why young readers attach to them. It's not just that they're at the same age or circumstances, is that, wow, these kids are smart. I like them. But they're still young enough to make mistakes. And that's makes the kids sometimes worry about them. And that's actually an important part of reading is worrying about the characters and put it all together. And I think the kids can relate.
Yeah. Why is it an important part of reading for children that they worry about the characters? I've never heard anybody say that before, but I think you're right.
The reason is because they know some in their own lives that things don't always work out the way they should. And kids know that sometimes bad circumstances happen and they can relate and say, wow, when something like that happened to me, it was awful. And so part of relating is this worrying about the character, being anxious for that character. If you've never experienced loss or disappointment or whatever, you cannot fully enjoy a story where someone else is about to experience loss or disappointment. So yeah, worry is very important.
Do you remember when you were a kid, the first story that you read that really hit you in the heart because it was like unexpectedly like, okay, so just a context. When I was a child, I read Little Women, and it
Mhm.
was the first time I read a story where one of the main characters dies. And I fully expected Beth to live. I fully did because in all my other books, everybody lived all the time. Mary went blind, but she didn't die from scarlet fever. You know what I mean? And
Sure.
to have Beth die, it was like jarring for me. Do you? But it was good because, like you said, it kind of brought in that like this does happen.
Mhm.
So from then on, whenever I read a story and a character was in peril or in danger, it did kind of heighten that. Is this character going to make it? Do you remember the first time you read a story as a child and that happened?
Yes, there were two of them, in fact, but the first one was Charlotte's Web. And
Yes,
spoiler, Charlotte died.
I
I
know
was
that was
devastated.
crushing.
And then there was Old Yeller, and the dog died.
I know.
I was just devastated.
Yeah.
And then a little older, Call of the Wild.
Yes.
And Buck's master, what was his name? I don't remember. He died. Buck made it, but the master didn't. So death and tragedy is highly effective. It might make your kid cry, but
Yeah, but that's
I think it's an
okay.
important part of the story experience because, bad things happen.
Yeah. I think the second one for me was Where the Red Fern Grows. Didn't see that coming. Anyway,
Mhm.
okay, back to fantasy, back to Bryan Davis's books.
Mhm.
So tell us about your your scale of you've got a lot of series. I want to say you had 5 or 6 different series, correct?
Actually, about 11 or
Oh
12
my
now.
goodness. Well,
I have
I'm
about,
way behind.
I'm getting close to 60 books now.
Wow.
In that story world with the Sacred Scales, that is actually the fourth series in that story world. It started with Dragons in Our Midst
Mhm.
long, long ago. It had 4 books as a young adult, and then a sequel series called Oracles of Fire, 4 more books. Then Children of the Bard, 4 more books. And there are 2 so far in this New Dragons of Camelot. There will be 2 more, making 16 books in the story world. Well, I have to amend that. The Oracles of Fire is now 5 instead of 4 because Tyndale split the biggest book into 2. It was almost 700 pages. So 17 books in the story world and 4 series. I also have a superhero series for kids. That's a trilogy. I have a series for boys that's for Wrote with Trail Life. I have a space adventure with the Astro Alliance series. That's got 3 books. I have Dragons of Starlight and Tales of Starlight. So I just have lots and lots of series from ages all the way down. Oh, I also have some new books. One about dogs, not so famous dog tales, not so famous dragon tales. Those were all the way down to 6 years old.
Wow.
Yeah,
well, the nice thing is for our listeners is that in the description of this podcast and the show notes are going to be the links to all of, you can find Bryan Davis's books, and he writes for all ages. He really does.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to give your kids really good, solid Christian literature that backs up. We've been harping for the last, I want to say, 8 months on discipleship, discipleship, discipleship. And so you don't want to do all that hard work of discipling your children in all the different other areas we talked about and then just hand them anything to read. You want to
Right.
give them things that are going to back that up. Why is that so important?
Well, consistency of thought. If you give kids stories that are meant to teach the opposite of what you've been teaching, you're telling them, oh, well, I can give you the bread of life and some deadly poison at the same time. What good is that? What kind of parent would you be? And the mixed messages can bring confusion.
Mm-hmm.
But I would allow my kids to read stories that are neutral, that aren't really strongly scripturally based, so they can have some exposure. Or if they ask to read something that has a negative message, I'll have called chaperoned exposure. Sure, after you read some chapters, let's talk about it, so that they'll see what's out there and understand what the opposing viewpoints are saying. But they'll be for the older kids. So there's some very popular stories out there that I did let my kids read, but not until they were, 13, 14 years
Oh,
old.
yeah. Yeah. Because kids, they think of things, they're very black and white. And when I was in college and taking my child development courses, one of the things that we learned was kids think very concretely. And in order for them, and this was back before, when conscience was a thing that you wanted your children to have,
Mm-hmm.
wanted them to have a conscience. If you introduce too much gray area into their life through movies, television, books, just in general, where there weren't real concrete rules like actions, consequences, actions, rewards, kind of things. Kids then had they called it seared their conscience, to where they weren't real sure the line between right and wrong was kind of blurred a little bit too much.
Right. Do the ends justify the means? We see lots of
Exactly.
stories like that. And
Yeah.
that'll show them that, no, it's not true. In the end, there is judgment always.
Yep. And so while we don't want to withhold them from, obviously when they're older and they're able to think logically and they're able to kind of talk through those things in ways that are thoughtful and really thinking through the consequences of the actions of the characters, that's when you can introduce them to books that maybe don't fully align with, it- I wouldn't want to say don't align with your faith, but that maybe could have some gray area stuff in there
Mhm.
that could be a little bit of an issue when they're younger, I suppose. Which is probably why Christians did you ever get pushback from Christians for writing fantasy? Because I know that in some circles, people tend to get a little gun shy about fantasy.
I did early on. I had a lot of
I'll
pushback.
bet.
You can't have stories about dragons. Dragons are evil. Dragons represent Satan, and how could you show a good dragon? So I did get a lot of pushback, but it hasn't been so much lately. I think people are starting to understand that you can tell stories, that God doesn't create anything inherently evil. It has to corrupt itself if it's going to be corrupt. So I showed dragons. I showed some of them as being corrupt, as you might expect. I showed some of them as not being that way. And it's true even of angels. I mean, we have demons who are fallen angels. God didn't create them that way, but Satan himself is a fallen angel. God didn't create him that way. So I think I can do the same with dragons. And the more I explained it, I think more the word got around.
Why do you write about dragons? It seems to be your theme. Did you as a child, you just
It's a
really love
device
them?
that came about because I had a dream one night about a boy who could breathe fire. I had written other stories that had no dragons, no fantasy. But when I had this dream, I told my oldest son about it, who was 13 years old at the time, and now he's 43. And he said, "That's a cool dream. You should write a story about the boy who could breathe fire, because then it'd be a lot better than those other stories you're writing." Yeah,
Okay.
13-year-old boys can be like that. So we brainstormed on how a boy could breathe fire. We said that his parents used to be fire-breathing dragons. They were transformed by God into humans back in the time of King Arthur. And so I wrote that story, and it became a bestseller, Raising Dragons. And so I became the dragon writer after that.
Before
Now,
dragons were cool.
before dragons were cool. Well, in the Lord of the Rings story world, there's definitely a dragon. He's evil.
Yes.
Good dragons were unusual
Yeah.
in fantasy.
Yeah.
So that kind of gained acceptance over time. But most of my books don't have dragons in them. So
Yeah.
I am the dragon guy, but I probably have about 23, 24 books with dragons in them, and I have almost 60 books. So it's just that those are the most popular ones.
Yeah.
Kids love reading about dragons.
They do. I mean, when you look at like the popularity of like the How to Train Your Dragon series, and they're great. They're cute movies. I like those movies.
And that's why I named my first book in the Dragon's Tale book, How to Contain Your Dragon.
Okay.
That's every title is a takeoff of a famous title. So that's why it's called Not So Famous Dragon Tales.
I like it. I like it. So going forward, is there a book that you're thinking about that you're like, I want to write this story that you haven't written yet or that you're working on?
There's right now I'm still working on the Dragon Tales books, but I have one going on my mind. It seems like readers really like what we call a multiverse.
Yes.
They're portals to copies of Earth. There's Earth 1, Earth 2, and Earth 3. And I have a series like that called Time Echoes. But I have an idea for doing one just for a little bit younger, 8 to 12, because Time Echoes is from 13 and up. And I have the superhero series where I have a boy who's brilliant. It's 3 books, and I've had readers say, "Can you expand that series?" And I was thinking about expanding it and going into a multiverse environment. And so that one's on my mind. I think that would be fun. So if I were to write something, that would be next.
I like that. I like that. My kids really like the Spider-Man multiverse movies that came out.
Mhm.
Those are fun.
And
Well,
DC has it with Flash. There's a lot of
yes.
multiverse in that.
Yeah, yeah, there's just a lot of that. I think that because you write you don't only write fantasy, but because in that kind of genre, you have just so much leeway you can do with so many different things, and it just can get very creative, and I think that's really cool.
Yep, it's a lot of fun. Nope,
That's
not
good.
many boundaries. The only boundaries I have for myself are moral ones.
Yes, yeah, I like that. So listeners, you can safely hand your children a Bryan Davis book, and you will not have to worry about what they're going to read there.
The only thing you have to be concerned about is age, because
Yes.
I have some for like a dystopian story called Reapers. I would not want a 7 or 8-year-old to read
Right.
because it's so intense.
Yeah, content. You got to look at who it's geared towards. Bryan, thank you so much for being with us today. I really enjoyed our conversation. Are all your books are published by Tyndale, correct?
No.
No. No.
all the
These series.
the Dragons books.
Okay.
There's all 17 of that Dragon series published
Okay.
by Tyndale. They also did the graphic novel version of Raising Dragons.
Okay.
So I have HarperCollins has done some,
Okay.
Mountain Brook has done some. Some of them were self-published.
Okay.
So I have a hybrid there.
We're going to go on Bryan Davis's website so you guys can see all the books that he has available. And also we'll reference Tyndale as well, because we're very grateful to them for putting us in contact with you, Bryan, and
Absolutely.
having you come on. So thank you guys so much for being with us today. Thank you, Bryan, for being with us and sharing.
Thank you, Dayle. It's been fun.
It's been great talking to you. I've enjoyed that. So for our listeners, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. Again, in the show notes of this podcast, you will find links to Bryan Davis's books. Enjoy them. You get your kids out there with them. Easter's coming in about 2 months now, 3 months. I don't remember when Easter's, March or April. That's all I know. I don't know. Sometime in March or April, there will be good Easter basket ideas, guys. Give your kids a little bit of, good literature that they can read. And he's got it for all ages. So what a fun thing for them to get started on. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thanks for coming back. We care about you. We pray for you. If you have any questions, Contact information in the show notes. Thanks again, Bryan. You guys have a great
You're
day.
welcome. Bye.